So on behalf of myself and Wiser, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of these lands and waters, the Wurundjeri people. I acknowledge and respect their continuing connections to their lands and waters, their stories, traditions, and living cultures, and the contribution to the life and spirit of our community. I pay respect to past, present, and future elders and extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So I'm very excited to welcome and introduce our guest speaker today, Jo Marshall. But just before I do want to plug the last two webinars, which are next week. Next Tuesday, we've got Simone Heyman from Port Lincoln. So she's a third generation tuna farmer, and Simone's going to be talking with Claire Webber, the Vice President of Wiser, sort of been doing a bit of a conversation about Simone's story, which is one which is going to demonstrate what can be done when a new generation sort of shake up the system in the tuna industry, collaborating and innovating to develop their sort of new seafood business, Kin Seafood. And then next Thursday, so we have Sky Cherry. So we rescheduled Sky from last week because of the family emergency, COVID related, but all's good. And she's going to be talking to us next Thursday at 1 o'clock. And Sky's a lawyer, and she's Australia's top expert on workplace sexual harassment in rural industries, and has worked in farming and forestry and mining. So her webinar is going to be extremely relevant to what Wiser's been finding in our survey, which revealed that 1 in 5 women in the industry work in places where there is sexual harassment. There's a little film to watch beforehand, which is really good, called Grace Under Fire, and all the links are on Eventbrite. So today, though, we have Jo Marshall, who has been spearheading the Stay Afloat program, which aims to improve the mental health of the seafood industry from the grassroots up. So I'll leave it to Jo to explain more about the program if you don't know it already. But we found in research with Tanya King, myself, Sue Kilpatrick and Sue Brumby from the National Centre for Farmer Health, that the state of mental health in the fishing industry was at a much poorer level than the average Australian, where men in the fishing industry had levels of high and very high psychological distress, twice that of the general population. And this was mainly caused by job insecurity. And we also found that the people in the industry weren't seeking help. So this research that we did sort of gave numbers to what most of us in the industry already knew. And women in Wiser had actually started having this conversation already, trying to reduce the stigma around mental health. But once we had these numbers, there was a really compelling case to take to government for a program to address the problem. And I was hoping Barb Constas would be on the webinar today, and she might be joining us in a bit. She was travelling home from Melbourne Seafood Centre. And Barb's a long-standing Wiser board member, and she worked with Seafood Industry Australia to get the funding for the Stay Afloat program. And Barb now sits on the steering committee with myself, Alison Kennedy from the National Centre for Farmer Health, as well as Jo and Veronica Papacosta from SIA. So when the government agreed to fund the Stay Afloat program, the first thing we needed was a program manager. And we found Jo, who had a vast experience in delivering programs around improving wellbeing in the workplace in other industries, as well as doing some work in seafood in South Australia. And we really found the perfect person in Jo, who's so passionate about improving wellbeing. And she really had the approach that we felt would work best with the industry. So really working from the grassroots of the industry, you know, at that community level.
Okay.
So despite COVID, which basically scuppered the program from the start, and Jo's ability to be able to travel to communities and meet with industry face-to-face, Jo's been able to really build those deep and genuine relationships with everyone working with her in the Stay Afloat program across the country. Jo's incredibly open and collaborative, and from a personal perspective, being involved in this program and hearing the stories and the impact that the Stay Afloat program's been having, thanks to Jo, has been extremely rewarding. So on behalf of Wiser, I'd like to welcome Jo. We're really lucky to have you talking to us today. And so Jo's going to give us a bit of she's going to chat for a while, and then we're going to be able to have a Q&A session afterwards. So thank you, Jo.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Kirsten. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. I have a few acknowledgements of my own I'd like to kick off with. I'd firstly like to acknowledge that I meet you from the lands and beside the water of the Irraganji people up here in Cairns, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, emerging. And I'd also like to pay my respects to the land that I normally meet people on, and that is the land of the Kaurna people. My hometown is Adelaide. And I often, when I'm doing both mental health conversations and also other training sessions in my experience over many, many years, I like to share a small story to bring some meaning to these acknowledgements. And I had a phone call this morning from the Department of Fisheries here in Queensland, who've asked me to reach out to some commercial fishers who actually are First Nations people from the Minjerribah lands, which is Stradbroke Island. And I'm really excited at the opportunity to engage and find, for the first time that I know of, some First Nations people reaching out to actively seek to be a part of our program. And what we're hoping to do is find a trusted advocate within our program or more who are First Nations people, because we're really passionate about the peer-to-peer approach of industry looking after industry. So we'll keep people posted on our progress there, but it's very real, and it's really important that we are sharing these stories. I'd also like to acknowledge everybody on here who has lived experience with mental health problems and mental illness, and I dare say that's every single one of us. I'll share a little bit of my story shortly, but it's important we both acknowledge that. And I also say to people that we're going to talk about some statistics, and I'm going to share some stories that I feel are very important and very powerful. But talking about mental health at any level can trigger people's emotions in a whole range of ways. And so if at any point you feel that the information we're sharing brings up emotions for you of discomfort, of upset, and of triggering, please feel free to exit. We'd appreciate if you felt that way, that you let us know, and we can reach out to you afterwards and check in on you. But it's really important that first and foremost, we look after our own well-being and our own safety. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the collaboration of Seafood Industry Australia and Women in Seafood Australasia. As Kirsten said, I wouldn't be here without the amazing work of Dr. Tanya King and Kirsten and so many others in establishing this. And I have to say, having Kirsten, Barbara Constas, Veronica and Alison Kennedy of the National Centre for Farmer Health on the steering committee of this project has really driven the success of the program as I've come into the industry as somewhat of a newcomer. So now we are a small group. I would be happy to just sit here and take questions for the whole time. I've got a bit of a story of me, some short statistics to share, a bit of information about the mental health world, and a couple of stories to share with you. So I can share those. I encourage you to ask questions along the way. I've got plenty of content. I can either keep going and ask for, and we have question time at the end, but please don't hesitate to interrupt me along the way. So firstly, a little about me. I've always been passionate about well-being at work and well-being of other people. And for a number of years, particularly in the early stages of when I started my business, Culture Eyes, which is what brought me to the seafood industry, I felt that I was increasingly being asked to talk about mental health and mental well-being, and I thought I was a bit of an imposter. I thought that I didn't really have the right to help others look after their mental well-being if I hadn't had what we call lived experience of mental illness myself. The deeper I came into the industry, the more I realised that I did have some lived experience, and I'm doing something quite vulnerable today, and something I haven't done, and I'm going to share a little bit of my life story and how I think that that's developed both my skill set but also some of my lived experience that I didn't realise was perhaps mental illness at the time. So the first point I learned at a conference one time, I'm actually adopted. I was adopted at 3 weeks old from a hospital in Adelaide after my biological mother, Michelle, had found herself pregnant at the age of 16, and her family, who were extremely religious, rushed her out of town, popped her in the single mother's home and left her there until I was induced a month early so that she could get back to Perth for her school exams. I was brought up by a beautiful family who I still consider to be my parents, who've sadly passed away since. I never for a moment felt that there was a part of me missing, as we hear on all of the TV shows like Find My Family. And that was a great story and rhetoric for me. It was only as I learnt more and more about the world of mental health and tried harder and harder to understand some of my lifelong insecurities, fears and anxieties that I realised that the act of adoption is actually imposing a significant trauma on a newborn baby, and that may have set some of the path for my future challenges more than I realised. There's me with my also adopted brother right next to me. You'd never guess we're adopted when you look at the colour of his hair and mine and the facial features. And above is my mum and dad, dearly departed, my brother and my eldest son many, many years ago. The photo at the bottom to the right of the black and white one is actually, I've since met my biological family. They eventually married and had more children. So I have 100% blood brothers and brother and sister, and all of the mixed up half brothers, sisters, nephews and nieces that go with it. I don't consider them as immediate family, but I do consider I'm very lucky to have met them, and that helps, I feel, in how we kind of make sense of the worlds that we've been in. At the centre of the photo, and I left it in the centre when PowerPoint came up with it, is a photograph from me performing at a international gymnastics competition at the age of 14 as a member of the Australian gymnastics team. And it's funny that it was left in the centre, because that sport was so much the centre of my life for many, many years. We've probably all seen a lot in the media over recent times about the mistreatment of gymnasts at a range of levels. I can certainly say that I was probably too old for some of the really severe bullying and harassment, but I did spend from the age of 12 to 14 and a half at the Australian Institute of Sport in Canberra, away from my parents, billeted out to families who I'm sure didn't have to go through any sort of checks and balances beyond offering to feed us and drop us at the gym for 2.5 years. And during that time, I developed what I now understand to be some extremely severe anxiety problems, which culminated ultimately in me leaving the sport and having many, many years of what I now understand to be severe anxiety problems resulting from that. Those problems affected my self-esteem. I most certainly experienced body dysmorphic disorder for many, many years, and a whole range of other issues that took me until probably about 3 years ago to understand. The challenge that many of us don't realise, and I like to share with people, is when we realise in retrospect that we may have been experiencing these mental health problems, we realise that instead of understanding that we were unwell, what we've actually done is the perfectionist in us comes out. And so where I can now call these things anxieties and name them for what they are, what I really did was spent 40 years beating myself up for being weak, not good enough, not trying hard enough, and for giving up too easily. So the journey of recovery from understanding that has been hard, and it's also been enlightening, because self-compassion is my favourite word. Learning to offer yourself that is one of the hardest things that we do, but it also unlocks a whole lot of opportunity in life. I experienced some trauma in my married life, some fairly significant trauma, and the photo on the right is me as a single mum with my 3 beautiful sons. And the number on the front of young Max's shirt there is from when we ran together, which we've often done in fun runs and things. Fast forward to today, and this is my crazy blended family. I now have 4 sons. I've inherited young Harrison, who's got West written on his shirt there, and have just the most beautiful blended family, including Marty up on the top right, and Billy the dog, who's 18 years old and has his own mental health issues with dementia and an anger problem with other men. Go figure that out. And at the bottom, it can't be lost, the last 2 years of my life working with Seafood Industry Australia in this area that is enabling me to extend my passion for mental health has been a wonderful thing. I'm now completed a graduate diploma in mental health, and will shortly complete my master's. And I have to thank COVID in a way, because I don't know if I would have been in this role without what's happened in our world, and it's really solidified my career as being in the future in mental health and wellbeing. So, has anyone got any questions before I move on? No? Cool. So as Kirsten mentioned, and so did and so will I. I want to acknowledge Dr. Tanya King and Kirsten and the team of researchers. This is the graph that Kirsten was referring to when we surveyed, when they surveyed thousands of fishes, or sent the survey to thousands of fishes. What it came back with is this many graphs. It's an incredibly interesting study to read that covers way more than just mental health and wellbeing. So encourage anybody to grab a copy of that. But if you look to the right-hand side of this graph, what you see is that fishes are the blue bars. 16% of fishes experience high levels of psychological distress, and 6% very high. If we add those two figures together, that means that 22% of fishes at the time of the study were experiencing high to very high levels of psychological distress. If we look at the general population, those two numbers are 9 and 4, which is 13%. So almost double the number of fishes than the general population experience high to very high levels of psychological distress at any given time. Kirsten, please feel free to add comment to that. No, you're good. Okay. Very quickly, mental health first aid is one of the pillars of the Stay Afloat program. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the program today, but would love to talk to any of you about it afterwards. This arrow that's on the screen is, I guess, a key part of the framework of the Mental Health First Aid Australia mental health training program. And it's a continuum. It's very simply the continuum that we all exist upon all of the time. There are times that we are at the green end of that arrow where we're positive, we're healthy, we're functioning well. We're coping with the things that are going on around us. We can see the positives in life. We can see the positives that could come out of challenging situations. We feel able to solve problems and we're thriving. At the other end of the spectrum, we have levels of psychological distress that continue in a way that they have a severe impact on our everyday functioning. We become reactive instead of responsive. It's those automatic reactions that bring out our emotion before our logical brain kicks in to help us decide whether our reactions are a helpful one or not. We look to unhealthy coping mechanisms, such as missing work and doing unhealthy things. So sorry, I worded that poorly. Missing work can sometimes be one of the healthiest things we can do. Drinking, smoking, changing our diets to the wrong way. We can be overthinking, failing to sleep, losing sleep because we're thinking too much, constant worry, lack of energy and lack of sleep, despite the fact that we might feel constantly fatigued. And then there's the orange section in the middle, and that's where our situational challenges arise. All of us have stresses, all of us have worries. There's no free ticket in life. The orange place is where we go, and if we can work towards these coping mechanisms that help us resolve situations as they arise, rather than have them become chronic and have a severe impact ongoing, then we can head back towards the green end of that spectrum eventually. Mental Health First Aid as a training program addresses two things. It addresses people in that orange area where we say we're starting to see the signs of some distress. How can we have a mental health first aid conversation with somebody to help them identify where they're at and perhaps help them consider what mechanisms they might use, such as professional help or the support of a friend or some time off in order to get themselves back to positive, healthy and functioning. Mental health first aid also helps us deal with the situations down in the red. It could be a crisis situation, or it could be a situation where a person really is impacted, and it enables us to have the conversation with those that are seriously impacted to encourage them to get the appropriate professional help, and in a crisis situation to respond appropriately. I'm often asked, and often we have the conversation about what's the difference between a mental health problem and a mental illness and a mental disorder. So there's a book called, of course, I'm going to forget the name of it, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders is one of two worldwide guides to understanding what needs to be occurring in a person for them to have a mental disorder or illness, as opposed to a situational problem. Mental illness and mental disorder are one in the same. So the World Health Organization and the American Psychological Association, who wrote this document state that the terms mental illness and mental disorder are interchangeable. In our work with our trusted advocates, we tend to talk not about mental illness as much as mental health problems, because we can't diagnose. I go down to the wharf and I talk to fishers and they can tell me what's going on in their world, and we can maybe discuss that there's some mental health problems going on for them. A mental disorder or mental illness is something that will be diagnosed by a doctor or by another health professional. But what it is, what's the difference? There's 3 elements. So the DSM book is about that fat. There's hundreds and hundreds of different diagnoses, different disorders in there, and all of them carry the same 3 underlying factors. The first is a person is having major changes to their thoughts, feelings, and behaviours. Those changes impair their functioning. So it might be their ability to complete their work as they normally would. They might still be completing their work, but it's taking a whole lot longer. It might impair their ability to sleep, and at the extremes, it might impair their ability to carry on social relationships and be present in different situations. And the third factor that must exist is that it's persistent over time. So depending on what the disorder is, the DSM guide will tell you how long does a situation need to prevail for it to turn from a problem into a mental illness. When we're talking about the very varied symptoms that will follow a severe incident, such as a person passing away, the grieving process, such as a trauma, a car accident, a major event like that, we talk about the potential for post-traumatic stress disorder, for example. Now, you can have some really severe reactions, some big changes to thoughts, feelings, and behavior following an event like that. You can find yourself not able to function, but in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder, that's okay. Once it gets to 3 or 4 weeks and they're not starting to subside, then we're starting to get to that period where it's been persistent enough over time that professional support and help might be needed. That's just one example. Quickly, some stats that are interesting for people to look at. This information is from the National Health and Medical Research Institute from 2017. They do a massive study of over 10,000 Australians. I'd look for hands up if I was in the room with you. I'm guessing most people on this call have heard the statistic that 1 in 5 Australians have a mental illness at any given time. These are the statistics that fact comes from, and the Australian Bureau of Statistics have had some updated reports that support that number hasn't changed over recent years. So it's good to understand them and understand how they come into being. I'll start with the 3 most common. The 3 most common are anxiety disorders, depressive and bipolar disorders, and substance use disorders. They make up around 99% of all mental illnesses in Australia at any given time. Important to note that substance use disorder is a mental illness in the same way that an anxiety or depressive disorder is. If we have a look at the statistics, you can see there, or can anyone point anything out to me that, that stands out to them rather than me just talking at you? Have a look at the numbers there. What do you see? Put it in chat or call out. We're only a small group.
The fact that females suffer from anxiety and depressive and bipolar disorders more than men.
Yep, absolutely. So the commentary on that, Heidi, is that twofold. One of the contributing factors they believe is the fact that women continue to carry far more weight in terms of the home duties, despite the fact that more of us are in the workforce now. And sometimes that's because they feel they have to. And in other cases, like was my case, I put the pressure on myself that I didn't feel like I could be a good mum unless I worked full time and parented and cleaned the house and wifed full time. So that's part of it. And sadly, the other key contributor there is family violence. Anything else that anyone can see? The higher male rate of substance use disorders is largely driven by social factors. Some people argue that that's because men are less likely to talk about it. It's hard to know whether that's the case because this is a confidential survey, so the assumption is people are telling the truth. The other reality is, drinking is has historically been more of a male thing. And I read something fantastic the other day. 100 years ago, women weren't even allowed in pubs. There's some great stories from up here in Queensland about the first women that demanded entry and forced entry into hotels. And, even back as far as the 50s, the, drinking was really not socially acceptable for women. One of the things when we look at suicide data from history, which we're not going to do today, is that there was actually a spike in suicide rates amongst women in the 50s and early 60s. And that was a result of prescription drugs being poorly prescribed and women using freely available opioids, I think it was, to take their lives. So they used to call it mama's little pill. And that prescription rules were changed at that time, and the ability for women to use that particular tool was reduced. And it was around then that, women became more focused on the equality of being able to drink and participate in those ways. The other thing I often get asked about this table is, if you look at the right-hand column, it doesn't add up to 20. So 14 plus 6 plus 5 doesn't add up. The reason for that is that many, many people who are experiencing mental illness have what we call comorbidity. Comorbidity is when we have more than one condition at a time. And comorbidity exists across the spectrum of mental illness and physical illness. So the whole cart before the horse thing is really tricky in this space. People with anxiety disorders are more likely to engage in substance overuse. People with substance use disorders are more likely to become anxious or depressed. And the same goes for depressive and bipolar disorders. And it becomes even more complicated when we look at the fact that people with these disorders are more likely to become diabetic, high cholesterol, heart problems, and everything that goes with that. So the 3 major physical illnesses, and people with cancers, heart problems, and those physical illnesses are also more likely to develop mental health problems. So it's a really complex world where we can't just look at one cause for anything and go, okay, well, here's how we can fix it. Remembering in the seafood industry, of course, that we've got a whole lot of other factors that are different, not least of which is the fact that we are mainly rural and remote, and the access to care and help in these spaces, and the education, people's understanding of these issues, the health literacy, as they call it, is lower. So very, very quickly, the Stay Afloat program at a glance. When I started off, I was asked to establish 3 focus communities as a pilot, where we would engage 3 people in each community called trusted advocates. Those communities were identified, and we've since been working with Lakes Entrance, Newcastle and Darwin, and we still have 7 of the 9 original trusted advocates, and we still have a team of more than 9 involved in those communities. We've more recently been asked by the Queensland government to initiate 5 focus communities up here in Queensland, and we're engaging a minimum of 2 trusted advocates in each of those. The role and the description of a trusted advocate has changed over time as we've learnt how people like to go about their work and how many different approaches there can be depending on where somebody comes from in community. The second pillar of the program kind of sits hand in hand with the focus communities, and that was a result of fishermen, commercial fishers, telling us that when they do finally go and get help, go and see their GP or a counsellor, they spend the whole hour explaining what they do and why our industry is stressful. So they wanted us to help the supports in community understand. And you can think about it, I tend to have this kind of cartoon-like picture in my head that someone goes into a doctor and says, I'm a fisherman and I'm struggling. And he says, why, what could be stressful about fishing? Don't you just sit in your boat and hang your line over the edge and look out to sea? So we set out to create some collateral, some brochures, and I also had a PowerPoint presentation ready to share with general practitioners, medical centres and other supports in community in those 3 focus communities. We had varying levels of success. I still think there's work to be done, and in the future our trusted advocates who weren't involved in this part of the program will become more involved because they actually have the relationships in the community that can share that information. Suffice to say, though, in Darwin, we were successful in engaging with 1 major medical centre that already had a relationship and is already where most of the fishermen go to. And in New South Wales, we worked with the primary health networks who distributed brochures to every GP office in and around the Newcastle area. So there was some progress. So those two pillars are the three focus communities, and we're in the process now, as the pilot comes to an end, of seeking funding to expand the program and extend it so that we'll end up with at least 50 primary focus communities that also draw in support from other smaller fishing communities around them. So we hope to impact over 100 communities. I'd like to say when, but if we get the funding. The other two pillars of the program have been and continue to be available to all fishing communities nationally. The first of those is community mental health training and education. So that can happen in a few ways. The first is through our mental health first aid courses. We're running those online and in person. In person's fantastic if you can get 10 to 15 people in an area together for either 2 consecutive days or 1 day across 2 different weeks. We can bring one of our national network of mental health first aid trainers to you to deliver that training. We worked with Mental Health First Aid Australia to tailor it, so the stories and examples that are used in that training are relatable to fishing industry, to seafood industry. They're not, the curriculum itself doesn't change, but we certainly have mental health first aid trainers who we've trained about our industry. One of the prerequisites is if they're in Cairns and they're going to deliver training, they will do their homework and go out and meet some fishermen and some industry people in Cairns beforehand. So that training is very well received. And then, for example, I'm up here in Cairns at the moment, and the fabulous people at Austral Fisheries have involved me in their onboarding or their induction program for all of their crew that are going out to sea to catch for the prawn season. So they're all going to be out for the next 11 weeks. And I'm spending an hour presenting to 2 large groups of all of their crew, from deckhands to vessel cooks to skippers. Every single member of crew that's going out to sea is spending an hour with me, and we're leaving them with tools to help them manage stress, tools to help them keep having positive conversations, tools around gratitude and mindfulness, and some language that will really, we hope, help them while they're at sea this time. So anytime you've got an event or a conference or a meeting or a gathering, we can find a way to help you have an impact and help share the message of mental health and wellbeing. Finally, we have community resilience grants. We have closed the final round of resilience grants, but if anybody on here that doesn't know about them says, hey, I'm really keen to see if I can sneak one in, I can let you know that our selection panel is made up of wiser members, and I haven't set a date with them yet to meet, so we can probably stretch to a day or so if anybody hasn't applied for one of these grants and is interested. They're $2,000 grants aimed at connecting members of our industry. We know that human connection is the most powerful preventative measure for mental illness. If we can get people connected and sharing stories, and particularly offering some support to each other, we know that mental health and wellbeing improves as a result of that. So $2,000 to run events that create connection between people, and often they have a theme around mental health and wellbeing, at the very least sharing some collateral and hand out some booklets and tools for mental health and wellbeing. So please feel free to get in touch with me after this to talk about that. So I want to quickly share a couple of stories, because it's the stories that really matter. We have to present to the Department of Health, who funded the project regularly, and I prepare all manner of statistics and information for them to tell them we've impacted 10,000 people, we've had 3,000 mental health conversations, and so on and so on. But one time, not that long ago, I said, I just want to tell you a story. And they said, this is what really matters to us the most. This is a difficult story. When I thought I was coming into the world of suicide prevention, I didn't really stop and consider that we might end up being involved in trauma response. I'd like to welcome Tony Hedich, is with us today. She's the wonderful woman pictured down there on the left-hand side of the screen. Tony has joined us as one of our trusted advocates in Darwin. She is the 3rd or 4th generation. Tony, you might want to correct me if you do have a word with us later. Daughter of Norm, who's also in that bottom picture. Norm Hedich, some of you may know, is an absolute legend of the Gulf of Carpentaria and northern fishing area. Tony decided she'd become one of our trusted advocates due to her passion for the future of the fishing industry and wanting to engage and encourage young people to come along. The photos you can see are what I took when I went on my first visit to Darwin, and up on the left there you can see a big white bearded man called Smeds. Sadly, Smeds passed away through drowning. late last year. And Tony, of course, was on the phone to me and was put in the incredibly difficult position of being both the trusted advocate responding to care for the mental health and well-being of herself and her colleagues, but also being an immediate, effectively family member of Smed's who'd worked for the family business most of her life and an employee of that business. So I want to quickly share that when Tony did that, we spoke regularly about a range of things. But when I first met them, Norm said to me, I love the fact that my daughter's doing this, Jo, but this mental health thing, it's not for me. I'm an old typical Australian bloke. I'm not into talking about my feelings and going to see psychologists and stuff. Tony worked hard and beyond what I would imagine the scope, what I imagine the scope of a trusted advocate to be when she was that close to this tragedy. And she followed and got help for herself and encouraged the 4 people involved to spend just 30 minutes with our clinical support psychologist so that he could literally list for them the signs and symptoms that they might like to look out for. It was hard for Tony just to get them to do that. They looked out for the signs and symptoms, and at a point in time, all 4 of the people most immediately involved elected to go to their GPs to get a mental health plan and to get support to ensure that they could recover from the tragedy and perhaps some of the other mental health problems that they'd been experiencing. I know Norm has now said that he doesn't know where he'd be if his daughter hadn't been involved in the program. And I did see the other day that he has just himself signed up to do our mental health first aid course. So I've invited Tony to have a quick word with us if she's comfortable. This may have also impacted her as well. So I said to Tony, you just decide when we're online if you'd like to have a word with us or not. I can't see you in my little strip of
Hi guys.
Here she is. So Tony, are you comfortable to just have a quick word about whatever you want as a trusted
Can I, in 2 minutes, because your timing is perfect. I've had someone just walk through the door. I'll literally be 2 minutes.
Yeah, okay. You're going to go and serve someone. Okay. Tony will come back to us. So I'll take a moment to open the floor. Has anyone got any questions or comments at this stage? No, you're so quiet. You're even quieter than the fisherman I spoke to yesterday. So what I'll do is I'll move on and we'll come back to Tony. I want to share another story, and this is obviously a much more positive story.
Jo?
Sorry. Can I just run in because Eliza's just stuck her hand up. I don't know if you can see it. Sorry.
No, I can't. Hi, Eliza.
Hey, Jo. Can you guys hear me all right?
Oh, I can see you now too.
Hello. I'm sure you might cover it in the rest of your presentation, but I think one of the questions I had is, what was your biggest challenge in approaching industry on, as Norm was saying it, you know, he's an old Australian bloke, and sometimes I don't like to talk a lot about their feelings. So, yeah, my question was, what was your biggest challenge with engaging with industry on this?
Such a good question, and no, it wasn't in my presentation. Well, the biggest challenge initially was COVID, because fishermen are not a group of people that like to talk over Zoom, and I couldn't go and visit any of the communities. So, you know, the biggest challenge originally was getting on the ground. But if I talk about it now, I'm getting on the ground all the time. And it's almost, the conversation is so similar everywhere I go, particularly with some of the older fishermen who they'll hear that I'm involved in a mental health program. They'll say, oh, look, mental health, yep, it's good for the younger blokes, or I'm not interested in that. Or often, because particularly in Queensland, for example, there's been a lot of government reforms. So I'll often hear, don't talk to me about mental health. You go tell the government to change the rules, because the government's caused all my problems. So people say, yeah, I've got mental health problems, but it's not my fault. Go fix the cause. So there's a few tactics that I use. The biggest tactic is listening, nodding, and showing that I'm prepared to try and understand. The other phrase that I use, and I hope you don't mind me doing a little swear word on your webinar, Kirsten, but I visited Townsville last week, and I had been told that the fishermen there were angry and they would not be interested. I was lucky enough to meet 2, and that group somehow miraculously grew to 6 over the next hour. And when I saw the first big burly bloke on mental health, you know, I said, all right, well, let's not worry about mental health. You just tell me what's pissing you off at the moment. And he packed up laughing, and he went ahead and told me what was pissing him off at the moment, and then naturally led himself into a conversation about how that's affecting his mental health. His mates concurred. They talked about the impacts on their wives. I talked to them while I'm at it. For a plug, I would love more introductions to wives and partners in industry, because I've found them particularly difficult to get to. And I know that there's enormous value in conversations with them. And so it really has been about starting a conversation and listening. One of the challenges our trusted advocates have had, because they've been through, to finish off the Townsville story, by the end of that conversation, the spokesman of the group basically said, so really, if we want help with mental health, if we want you to help us, we need to help you find one of these trusted advocates. Is that right? And I said, that's exactly right. He said, cool. The other thing they often say is, so how can you help us? So here's all my problems. How, and I get it quite in an attacking tone of, how are you going to help me? And I'll say, I'm going to help you look after your mates. I want to help you understand that while we're experiencing all the other challenges that might be government reforms and everything else, my job is to try and make sure that we don't lose anybody. And if I can help you have a conversation with your mate when you're worried about him, then that's how I can help you. And again, in Cairns last time I was up, and I'll touch on it with the next photo I'm going to send, I actually had a conversation with a gentleman who rang me the next day and said, geez, Joe, I reckon you're onto something. I went, yeah, I think I might be too. But he actually told me that he thought that the guy from the boat next door might be suicidal. But it was almost like it rolled off the tongue that we have these conversations saying it's it's going so badly. He's in a dark place. And this gentleman spoke to the guy that he told me was in a dark place the next day. And when he rang me, he said, you're onto something. This is real. And what he was really saying was, I know I said it, but I didn't realize it was true. I've now looked him in the eye, and this is real, and I need to help him. And I've read that brochure about how to talk to a mate, and I used it, and thanks. And it's the simple things like that. So I probably extended that answer a little bit, Eliza, but it's a big networking job.
Thanks, Joe. That was really insightful. And I think the one thing that I struggle with talking to industry is, you kind of get that, what are you going to do? And I think, really good insight. And I'm looking forward to seeing what the program does in the future. Definitely, it's great.
Well, I'd love to involve you, Eliza. I'm very, very happy to have a longer conversation with you after this, and give you, I guess, a bird's eye or a side view on, other more specific challenges that you have. Tony's back. What did you sell some Spanish mackerel, Tony?
Yes, and a seafood cookbook. So, all going well.
So we might just hand to you, if that's okay.
I kind of missed a little bit of what you were saying, but yes, Smeds wasn't an employee, he was family, and being able to have that support and actually having a little bit of confidence behind me when it all happened was extremely helpful. I actually sort of felt like I didn't really know what I was going to do, but I knew that I needed to be able to support everyone and make sure everything was okay, as well as making sure I was looking after myself at the same time.
Yeah, she's an amazing young woman, and I hope we have you in both seafood and the mental health world for a long time, Tony. So I'll share one more quick story, and then it might be an opportunity to wrap up or ask questions. The guy you're looking at here on the left is a guy called Floyd. He works with the man I was just talking about, who is a fisherman up here in Cairns. And just to wrap that story up, I got on his boat and he growled at me and said, the guy on the boat over there, he might lose his business. What are you going to do about that? I rang him, or he rang me the next day, as I said, and said, look, he said, I think you're onto something, Joe. And so that was a good conversation. But I then rang this guy last week and said, look, I'm coming to Cairns. I promised you that I'd come back and that you said I could look you up. Can I catch up with you and Floyd when I'm there? And he never rang me back. I was a bit disappointed and thought, oh, well, it is hard to catch these guys. Yesterday, I was in the room that you can see with all the people with their arms in the air. They're our crew that are going out on the prawn season this week. And up popped Floyd. He's working for Austral Fisheries in the next month, and he came up to me afterwards and said that he's been really thinking about mental health and mental health first aid, and he's going to not only do the training but become one of our trusted advocates. And it is hard to get fishermen on the ground to take these roles, and I'm really excited about his potential to be involved with us. And it rounds out, I guess, to finish what you were saying, Eliza. I look back now on the year and a half of trying to engage, and the amazing people that have taken my calls and got on Zoom and let me speak to their teams and conferences and that sort of thing. But the reality in this work is nothing beats meeting people. And at the moment I'm traveling, for a couple of days every week. I'm learning that not to be a complete slave to travel as I'm tempted to, because I have got that beautiful family behind me. But if anybody wants a visit or wants to establish some trusted advocacy in their area, we're kind of at a point now we get how to do it. We're looking for more funding, but while I'm still going for the next 6 months in this program, we'll do everything we can to support you. So that's probably enough from me. Has anyone else got any other questions before we wrap up?
Joe, Sam Noland from Northern Territory has had a question. Hi, Joe. From your perspective, what has been the most impactful community resilience grant delivered so far?
Hey, Sam. Great to see you, by the way. That's a really good question. Quite a number of the community resilience grants have struggled to get traction or have been delayed as well. So we've quite a number sort of banked up now, ready to go because of COVID and because of the challenges with that. Probably the two most successful have both been a series that have been linked to other activities where fishermen are gathering. So one was in Tasmania and one was in Western Australia. Tasmania, the TISIC team, I must acknowledge, having developed the Stay Afloat branding and were doing work in mental health long before I came along. They did a road show to various seafood communities where they provided some training on some other topics and combined it with use the funding to both develop some training materials but provide catering and barbecues and conversation pieces for people who attended about mental health and wellbeing. So that was very successful. And similarly, the Southern Seafood Producers in Western Australia had a community resilience grant series where they got there's a fantastic program called Rural Men's Health. They had their AGMs for various associations in remote locations in Perth. So because it's so hard for them to get their people together, they did it on the back of another meeting, and they got Rural Men's Health to come and present their model, which is all around treating your body as if it's a car and putting it above the pit every now and then and checking out your physical and your mental well-being. The team in Darwin have also done, the trusted advocates in Darwin have done some great stuff on wharf. So we've had some farewell barbecues for the prawn season where we've had about 50 people attend a barbie and really haven't talked too much about mental health, just had a bit of a laugh, handed out some brochures and had some one-to-one conversations. They also had a day where they delivered Stay Afloat donuts to crew. And I'm just trying to think what else. The one I would have loved to see happen was in South Australia, where we were hoping to do the Stay Afloat community walks. So we had some entries set up in our major fun run that was going to be driven by by Karen Holder, from who our ex-president, and she. We were going to get t-shirts printed up and have people walking 12 kilometres with PFD floaties around their waists, and we were hoping to tie it together with a similar walk through Claire Webber on the west coast of South Australia and down in Robe in the southeast. So we've also got coming up, Ocean Watch are putting on some online events where they're showing a movie, one aimed at oyster fishers and the other at dive fishers, and they're showing two pertinent movies and engaging one of our mental health first aid trainers who's also a psychologist to come and facilitate some online conversation. And we're going to send packets of popcorn and nibbles to the homes of all the participants to share when they come online. So that's a smattering. I'll probably remember another one in a moment.
Heidi just had a good idea.
What's that?
Can we do something? You mean seafood directions, Heidi? Yeah. like at lunchtime or something like that, we could do like a wiser walk for
that's a great idea.
Stay Afloat or something like that.
That's a great idea. I'll take that offline with both of you, because we certainly are planning a huge presence for Stay Afloat at Seafood Directions.
Yeah.
It's a question of how and what we can use grant money for versus what I can sneak out of Seafood Industry Australia.
Joe, did you just want to like stop sharing screen, and then if there's any other questions, we can see everybody a lot easier. So is there anyone else who has a question for Joe or a comment?
Hi, Jess.
Hi, wonderful presentation. I don't have a question. I just wanted to say it was great.
Jess is the wonderful person behind how the Stay Afloat program looks and feels on the website and the collateral, and she gets to hear about it an awful lot. And I'd just like to thank Barb Constas for joining us too. Wonderful, Barb. You just had such an incredible impact on me in the program.
Thanks,
So
Joe.
send us
so kind of
good vibes. Oh, sorry, Barb, go on.
No, I just want to say thanks, Joe, and that's so kind of you. But
so we've got 2 major funding requests in to get this program extended and expanded, and we are determined for that to happen. So send us every good vibe that you can over the next months, and don't forget, you can contact me. Please follow Stay Afloat Australia on Facebook. We've also got Instagram now, and my mobile number and email address are readily available. People sometimes say, I don't want to bother you. I'm like, no, I will take as many calls and conversations as I possibly can, because, you know, it's all of you that are making the difference. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Joe. It's been great to hear, you know, your personal story. And I think that's one of the nice things that we've heard, you know, across some of the webinars that we've been doing, you people, you know, being really open and sharing, you know, things that you wouldn't normally hear, you know, if you're meeting kind of at an industry thing. And hopefully we're going to get lots of money to keep the program going, because I think it's just brilliant. And so thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you to everybody who came along today, and hopefully we'll see you next week. And stay in touch with us, and you know, and the things that are coming up, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Kristen.
Thank you.